Good evening. We are live. Welcome to our weekly debrief. And this is our first one after the Christmas break. So Happy New Year to everyone. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am Daniela, and I am very, very pleased to host Dr. Sarah Myhill. Hi, Sarah. I just wanted to say a few words about Dr. Myhill. She's clinical director of the College of Naturopathic Medicine, medical director of the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, and educational committee member of the British Society of Ecological Medicine, and as well as being an award-winning author of 7 books. Sarah is very, very well known for her work with the mitochondrial dysfunction, and she's a very, very popular speaker, especially here with us at the Klinger Institute and in the UK, and I guess over that as well. So, Sarah, you're a very popular speaker. Thank you for being with us tonight. And yes, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Daniela. Very kind introduction. So thank everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully the PowerPoint will come up in a moment. There we go. So Daniela's very kindly asked me to talk about 4th phase water, which sounds a rather esoteric subject to talk about, but it is so important. It explains so many phenomena and so much pathology. And that's important because if you can understand the mechanism by which things go wrong, then that has obvious implications for management. Now, the point here is that
okay, you're back on.
About that, sometimes it goes off. So just give me a few seconds, then it seems to reload itself. But I say water is very important stuff. It is the single most important molecule to life. 2/3 of the total weight of our body is water. But if you tot up the number of molecules in our body, because water is such a tiny molecule, it makes up 99% of all the molecules in the body. So it's very important stuff. Now, to do its job right, it has to be in the right form. And that right form we now know is called 4th phase water, gel water, or exclusion zone water. And the reasons why. Now, much of what I'm going to be talking about is from Gerald Pollack's book. He's a physicist who really looked at water and asked, what explains a capillary action? What explains osmosis? What explains, gel structures? And he came up with this wonderful, well, he's been working for decades, this wonderful book, which to me just read like a detective novel. I could hardly, couldn't stop putting it down because it was so interesting. So I'm going to basically skip through the 4th phase of water, its physicochemical properties, and then we'll talk about the clinical applications of that, why that's important for us as physicians and as patients to understand what's going on. So what is 4th phase water? So, water we know exists in 3 forms: ice, liquid, and a gas. But that doesn't explain, many phenomena of gelatin, why ice is slippery, transpiration, Brownian motion, and all those things. All those phenomena we can explain through 4th phase water. So the mechanism of this is that a water molecule is made up of an oxygen atom, think of that as my head, and 2 hydrogen atoms, my two hands. And but the electrons in there are not fairly distributed because an oxygen atom has got 8 protons, that's 8 plus charges. A hydrogen has only got 1 plus. So with any water molecule, which has got a slight angle in it, the oxygen atom is going to be slightly negative and the hydrogen atoms are going to be slightly positive. Now, this becomes important against a hydrophilic, a water-loving surface, or indeed any surface. Against a water-loving surface, you get hexagonal shapes. Against the water-hating surface, you get graphite-like structures. I beg your pardon, you get diamond-like structures, which is called a clathrate. But the surfaces in the body are largely speaking, they're hydrophilic, they're water-loving. And when that happens, oxygen and water molecules line themselves up as a hexagon. I hope you can see my pointer, but here we've got an oxygen, hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. So these are like a honeycomb structure. And then they build up on top of each other, one on top of another, one on top of another in this form. And that has structure. It's called gel water. But the important thing about this is that, well, I'll go through the features of this, but this is a picture of exclusion zone water forming. This is from Gerald Pollack's book. So here we have a membrane. These dark particles are tiny little plastic beads, which allows us to be able to see exclusion zone water. It's called exclusion zone water because the structure is so tight, it excludes everything, even protons. And of course, protons are tiny. They're little hydrogen atoms. And it takes a little time to build up. So after 10 seconds of mixing, you've got here about a few 300 microns. After 2 minutes, it grows. And after 5 minutes, you can get layers up to a few millimeters thick. So it does take time to form. And as you can see, it's excluding these little plastic beads. And again, they form against any and all surfaces. And in this structure, in this form, they have structure, as you will see. So if you tot up all the charges in there, so all the oxygen charges, the electrons associated with oxygen and the protons, you find that the chemical form is slightly different. So in liquid water, we have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. But exclusion zone water has 3 hydrogens to every 2 oxygens. And that means the net charge of each one of these hexagons is -1. It's negatively charged. And because the structure is so tight, the proton is excluded. So the free water, which is beyond the exclusion zone, is positively charged. That hydrogen atom sticks to a water molecule to get an H3O molecule, and that's called hydronium. And that, of course, is positively charged. So we have charge separation. And I'm sure some of you amongst you will immediately realize, that's what membrane function is all about. It's all about charge separation. But this happens naturally in nature without any energy. And again, what's so fascinating about this is these honeycombs, as they stack themselves up in a 3D thing, this forms a helical structure that's the same shape as that of the structure of DNA. So you can see how fundamental this is to all biological processes. The other interesting thing is the subunit of ATP synthase. Again, that is without exclusion zone water, it wouldn't be in the correct shape. It allows it to hold water, and of course, water is essential for the business of energy generation, which is called chemoosmosis. But as I say, the most important effect about exclusion zones is they're electrically charged. So effectively, we've got a small battery here. And without any energy from the cell itself, we've suddenly got charge potentials across membranes. So against the membrane, so all membranes are going to be negatively charged. And then beyond that, it's going to be positively charged. So the free water circulating is positively charged. And of course, the same is going to apply on the other side. So do get the book if you want the details. And this charge can be measured. It can be measured by pH, because if you've got a concentration of hydrogen ions, it's going to be slightly acid. And of course, the closer to the exclusion zone, which is negative, the lower the pH, because and the further away you go is the higher the pH. And this can be measured, anybody with a bent towards physics can do this. But guess what? It's all been done by Gerald Pollack and other researchers. So what happens in a capillary? Now, this is actually when Pollack was doing his work, he was using a water-soluble surface, a hydrophilic surface, nephron, and he was showing how you get negative charges that line this, and then the water in the middle has a positive charge. And this explains the circulation within capillaries. Oh, hang on, I've jumped ahead of myself, as I usually do. If you've got charges across membranes, this is how nerves work. This is how muscles contract, because the electrical waves across membranes. And this explains how local anesthetics work, because local anesthetics wipe out exclusion zone water. And if you wipe out exclusion zone water, you can't pass an electrical pass electrical wave. So this is a little graph illustrating that. So this is the lidocaine concentration and against the thickness of exclusion zone. As you can see, as you increase the concentration of general anesthetic, you thin the layer of EZ water, and obviously practically that results in anesthesia. You can't feel things; it goes completely numb. And my guess is there's a similar mechanism for general anesthetics. Again, the mechanism of action of general anesthetics has never been fully understood. What we do know is that the more fat-soluble the general anesthetic, the less you need in order to get a result. So the most fat-soluble anesthetics have profound effects. As you go less fat, I beg your pardon, the other way around. The most fat-soluble get the best effects. The least fat-soluble, the lesser effects. And it can all be explained in terms of exclusion zone water. So this is a fundamental mechanism by which drugs have their action. Now, but the point is, you don't get charge separation without energy. In Yorkshire, in this country, we call it, in life, you don't get out for nout. Most people realize that you don't get something for nothing. So for charge separation to occur, in living cells, there's got to be some energy. And for a long time, it was a mystery. Where is this energy coming from? Where is the energy coming from that drives this charge separation? Until a fortuitous experiment. Because whilst studying these exclusion zones, the lamp that was observing these, because you can see these under a light microscope, was switched off. And they noticed the exclusion zone has reduced in size. So this is exclusion zone when the light is very dim. But when they switched it on, they watched the exclusion zone grow. It took several minutes to assemble, but they worked out that it was energy from light is powering this water battery. And of course, this is the starting point for photosynthesis, isn't it? Because photosynthesis is all about charge separation and generating energy. So the next question they asked is, well, which part of light works best? And the fact is that all wavelengths were effective. So, all wavelengths of sunshine from ultraviolet to far infrared were effective at creating exclusion zones, but some wavelengths were better than others. So ultraviolet was the least effective, visible light moderately so, but far infrared light at 3000 nanometer wavelength, that was the optimum wavelength for generating exclusion zone water. So, as I say, there's much debate as to how that happens. I'm not going to go into that here, but it's Gerald Pollack's books discuss it. And then we have to ask why they stopped growing. And the reason why they stopped growing relates to energy coming in, because as that exclusion zone water gets thicker and thicker, it gets more and more negatively charged. Beyond that, you have a greater and greater positively charged area, and you get to the stage where you just can't make any more because the charges are so great. So it's energy coming into the system that drives exclusion zone water, and eventually you end up with a balance. Now, again, no system is perfect. If you start to separate electrons from protons, you end up making free radicals. And the body has to deal with those because we know free radicals, essentially they're molecules with an unpaired electron, are highly reactive and damaging. And this is why every cellular compartment in the body has superoxide dismutases. So within mitochondria, these are manganese dependent. Within the cells, they are zinc and copper dependent. And outside cells, they're zinc copper dependent soldases. So again, for these exclusion zone waters to be of use in normal life, we need a few minerals. But say the point is, wherever you have surfaces, water and light, you will be generating free radicals. So another fascinating experiment was done. Again, as they were observing these effects over time, they found that the thickness of exclusion zone varied throughout the year. And constancy could only be achieved by using a Faraday cage in order to exclude all external effects. And what they found is in December to January, reactions were slow, but they were faster in the summer, and they increased with sunspots and solar flares, and they changed with the moon eclipse. And this may be a mechanism by which background radiation from the universe impacts on exclusion zone water and has profound effects on our health. And this is the work done by Voykov, who looked at the light emanating from aqueous solutions throughout the day, and in response to solar eclipses and the likes. And again, look at the book, but you can see very profound changes. And what's so interesting is the optical energy within water can persist for over a year, even after that water has been in a dark place. So it's a very stable setup. And this light-driven, electrical energy explains the flow of blood. Because I've always asked myself, how can blood flow through capillaries? Because where the blood comes in from the arterial side and where the blood leaves on the venous side, there is no pressure difference. The pressure is the same. So blood doesn't travel through capillaries by a pressure mechanism. And there's another interesting fact here, because the diameter of your smallest capillary is about 8 microns, whereas the diameter of a red cell is, a big one, is 5 microns, whereas a red cell is 8 microns. So how on earth can a red cell get through a capillary that is smaller than the red cell itself? Obviously, they have to twist and distort to get through, but how can that happen? And again, a fascinating experiment that Gerald Pollack did is he just suspended a Naphian tube in water. And if he left it there for a little time, the water started to flow through the tube. Now, he couldn't predict which direction it went in. Sometimes it would go one way, sometimes it would go the other way. But again, what are the forces that are driving this? And this is it when he looked in terms of charges, because the lining of the Naphian tube, and we think of that as a capillary lining, is very negatively charged. Bulk water running through that capillary is positively charged. But if you think of this side as the artery, this side as the vein, as the tube gets larger, these positive particles repel each other to push themselves apart, and that effectively creates an electrical suction that pulls water, or rather blood, through the capillary. So without being warm, without our capillaries being warm, and of course that's impacted even more by sunshine, we don't get any circulation. So it's also exclusion zone water explains capillary action. Now, things like capillary action, transpiration, surface tension, these are all phenomena which are not diagnoses, they're clinical pictures. And, I remember at physics, we were told, there's surface tension, which is, and there's capillary action, as if that was a diagnosis. It's not, it's a clinical picture. It can be explained by exclusion zones and charge separation. And again, Pollack does this beautifully in his book. So there we've got exclusion zone water on the surface, which is negatively charged, extends up the side, and that you then have a concentration of positive ions in the middle, and positive draws negative, and that sucks the whole, if the capillary is sufficiently small, that whole column of water then rises up the tube. But it's dependent on background radiation. With no radiation, it doesn't happen. That's where we get the energy from. And it's also so interesting because, again, Pollack suspended beads in water and had a light source coming from one side. Now, of course, the light is coming from one side. You get a thicker layer of exclusion water on this side, which is negatively charged. You get more dense positive ions outside that. The positive ions pull the negative ions, and so these beads just move towards the light effortlessly without any energy from the bead. And of course, this is what happens with microbes. You put microbes, bacteria onto a plate with a light source, they will inevitably be drawn towards the light source without having any motilities, without any flagella or whatever. And again, exclusion zone water explains Brownian motion. If you look at water molecules from a light microscope, they're moving around, they're shaking like that, because depending on where the light's coming in, they'll have thick layers of protons which will draw them in, thin layers which will then send them apart. So they're constantly in a state of motion. Again, it's dependent on heat for that to happen. Now, this is important in the body because every membrane, enzyme, protein complex will have some surfaces which are hydrophilic, and that draws in a honeycomb structure. Some surface will be hydrophobic, and that pulls in diamond-like clathrate structures. And this means that these structures become very stable. And that's so important because, as some of you know, my special interest is mitochondria. Now, if you just threw, all the ingredients into a pot, you'd make for a very inefficient mitochondria. For mitochondria to work, it's like a car assembly factory, building cars. You've got to have exactly the right pieces coming in at just the right time, in the right place, in order to generate cars. And it's exactly the same in mitochondria. All your enzymes, all the respiratory enzymes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, ATP synthase, have got to be in exactly the right three-dimensional place in order to be efficient producers of the energy molecule ATP. And it's exclusion zone water that allows that to happen. And so there's a fascinating, so essentially these water structures hold information. And there's a fascinating study done by Luc Montagnac, who of course discovered HIV, and asked if it is the case that these molecules can hold energy, can it be transmitted to a third party? And I think this is the right experiment. Yeah, it is. So what he did is he took a test tube where he put some DNA in it. And of course, left it there for a while. And exclusion zone water, of course, forms around the DNA as it does in the whole of life. He then put a test tube next to that with just pure water in them and left them next door to each other with some electromagnetic energy coming from the outside world for some time. The idea here being is that the structure of exclusion zone water transmits that energy, or rather that information, to the adjacent test tube. He then poured in DNA, the raw material to make DNA, so guanine, the DNA nucleotides, the 4 nucleotides, left that to mature, and guess what? In that exclusion zone water, they produced exactly the same shape of DNA. So this energy from exclusion zone water also transmits information. Here's an example of how exclusion zones explain why salt water and fresh water don't mix. The Baltic Sea, which is contained within Denmark, Finland, and the west coast of Russia, is brackish because, of course, it's fed by fresh water, so it's got a low level of salt. When it comes into the North Sea, it doesn't mix. And that's because of exclusion zone water. There's much higher levels of salt in seawater, about 35 grams per kilogram, than in the brackish water of the Baltic Sea, about 7 grams per kilogram. So you get much tighter bonding because all molecules pull in exclusion zone water, and that gives them also gel-like structure. So much so that these two waters don't mix, and there's a very clear demarcation line between the two. Of course, they and mix eventually, and this is obviously in calm conditions when you can see it. And then we've got the picture illustrating that. Salt in water, as you can see, it's got all these charged particles holding itself together almost in a gel-like way. Again, exclusion zone explains osmosis. And osmosis is the passage of water from an area of low concentration to a high concentration through a semi-permeable membrane. And again, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but we can explain this because of exclusion zone water. Okay, and again, so I'm going to skip over that. I'm getting a bit technical now. But again, exclusion zone water and osmosis explains the very rapid swelling you get with any sort of injury, because water is constantly being drawn within cells and it's held in the right shape by very powerful connective tissue that physically stops these cells from swelling. You disrupt that connective tissue and they immediately swell up very rapidly. Okay, I'm going to touch on deuterium because we know this has important implications for cancer. Deuterium is heavy water, so it's got a hydrogen ion that has a proton and a neutron, so it's more dense. And all water has got some deuterium in it, about 150 parts per million, which is quite high. So in total weight, we have 9 times more deuterium than magnesium in the body and 4 times that of calcium. So it's in the body in significant amounts. Now, deuterium has important physiological actions. If you have more deuterium, we know that results in cancer for all these effects. But the mechanism by which it drives this is because it massively disrupts exclusion zone water, because it just doesn't fit into that honeycomb structure. And that means all cell processes are less efficient. And what we do know is that deuterium depleted water is a proven benefit in treating cancer. You can make your own deuterium depleted water because it has a higher freezing point than ordinary water. So glacial runoff water is low in deuterium, and that may explain why people living in glacial runoff have much better longevity than otherwise. And if you give cancer patients deuterium depleted water, then these are some of the studies which have been done showing that survival is greatly extended. So it's not the sole part of, but it's certainly an important part of improving survival. So what about cell membranes? Now, as you know, the concentration of atoms and molecules within cells is very different from outside cells. And hitherto, that's always been explained by ion pumps. Oh, there are ion pumps that pump sodium out of cells and pull potassium in. They pump calcium out of cells and they pull magnesium in. And currently, over 100 different membrane pumps have been described. But the thing is, we can't explain that in terms of cell energy delivery. There just isn't enough energy to go round to explain how this works. And here we go. This is a guy called Ling. I should put the reference in here. But he calculated the energy to power all pumps exceeds the cell's ability to generate them by maybe up to 30-fold. And that's not including mitochondria. So, how is it possible that these ion pumps can work? And the answer is light or heat from the outside that impacts on exclusion zone water to allow proteins to flip from one side to another to say, kick calcium out, draw magnesium in, and that involves minimal energy, and that energy can be recycled, just like an elastic band. You can contain the energy within the change of structure of the protein, and that is then returned. So exclusion zone water is what allows that to happen. So this is the interesting bit. So how does this translate clinically for us humans? So structured water, say it's near solid. It explains that despite, say, 2/3 of our volume being water, we don't just collapse on the floor like a jellyfish. It gives us structure. It gives us, bones. It gives us muscles, which are all firm and solid. The other important point is that all membranes are negatively charged, and that is used to supply energy to individual cells in order to drive ion pumps, to mitochondria so they can work more efficiently. And ion pumps, all they do is they top up the natural phenomenon of exclusion zone water. Now, I think this is very important in the body, because if a surface is negatively charged, then that massively reduces friction. So in the bloodstream, it's essential to have good exclusion zone water, because that stops red cells, white cells, platelets sticking to each other. It stops them sticking to the lining of vessels. In fact, a clinical measurement that we often use is something called an erythrocyte sedimentation rate. So what you do is you take some blood and you put it into a capillary tube, and you see how long it takes to settle over the course of an hour. Now, if you've got good quality exclusion zone water, and that of course needs, and we'll come into what is required for that, there are all those red cells, all those white cells, all those platelets, they're negatively charged, and so it doesn't settle. It stays up, maybe 1 or 2 millimeters per hour. It's very slow. If you've got inflammation, one of the tests of inflammation is the erythrocyte sedimentation. It might settle at the rate of 20 or 30 or maybe 40 millimeters an hour. And that tells us you've lost exclusion zone water. And we also know that that is part of inflammation. So exclusion zone water and inflammation are inextricably linked. They are the same thing. If you've got inflammation, it's symptomatic of poor exclusion zone water. So if we can improve exclusion zone water, we can massively reduce inflammation. And as we've discussed already, exclusion zone water is essential for blood flow. You know, there's no pressure difference, as we said, and it's electrical forces which allow circulation of blood within the capillaries, and it's electrical forces that stop those blood cells sticking to each other. So it's essential for circulation, and as I think of this as reducing the mechanical friction in the system. And guess what? We all want frictionless lives. We all want lives that run smoothly, because if they don't run smoothly, that we have to put more energy into the system, and energy is exhausting and sapping. And I want to spend my energy on having fun, not on getting around things in my life that cause friction. And again, as we touched upon, it reduces biochemical friction, because as we've discussed, all molecules have to be held in the right three-dimensional shape, whether we're talking about actin molecules to contract muscles, whether we're talking about mitochondrial molecules to generate energy. They've got to be in the right position, otherwise they simply don't work. And it coats all surfaces of our limbs, muscles, tendons, so we can move them in a frictionless way. So when I move my arm around like that, there's no friction there. You know, it happens very easily. And that's because if a surface is negatively charged, then it slides over each other very easily, because the negative charges repel. And again, exclusion zone water coats many molecules, so they can render water soluble and can be carried in the bloodstream. And one example of this is cholesterol. And this explains why the total cholesterol in the body is never the sum total of the HDL and the LDL. So HDL cholesterol is a lipoprotein, it's carried in a protein, and that renders it water soluble. LDL is more cholesterol that's contained in another protein that makes it water soluble. But cholesterol can be carried around the body as cholesterol sulfate. And that, although you've got a fat soluble molecule, surround it with sulfate, and it dissolves beautifully. And this is based on work by Stephanie Seneff, and there's a link there. I do recommend you read that article. It's absolutely fascinating. So we should all be putting in interventions, especially if there's inflammation or poor energy delivery mechanisms, because exclusion zone water is vital to both. We all need to put in interventions to improve exclusion zone water. And the first thing is we need good quality cell membranes with a good hydrophilic surface. Now, of course, all membranes are a lipid bilayer. They're made up of fats which have a protein, a phosphatidyl group at one end and a tail in the middle. So the middle of a membrane is fat soluble and the outside is water loving. And to get that, we have to eat good quality saturated fats. So lots of lard, butter, coconut oil, goose fat, chicken fat, because those are quality fats for our membranes. And then we need a little bit of the unsaturated oils like the omega-3s and the omega-6, but not seed oils. Seed oils they're in far too great concentration, and very often they've been flipped into trans fats. So we need good quality membranes. And then we need water that ideally is low in deuterium. So I've just given you a little example there of how ATP, what a complex molecule ATP is. And we've got to be in the right space. And energy generation is so complex. And it's been hypothesized by Professor Nick Lane. He writes wonderful books, by the way. If you want to learn about mitochondria, do read Nick Lane's books like Power, Sex and Suicide. It is a wonderful start if you want to learn about mitochondria. But the business of making energy is incredibly complicated. It's called chemiosmosis. It's the most illogical, irrational process you could imagine. But Lane hypothesizes that much of this is because it weeds out deuterium, because deuterium water, heavy water, is very damaging to ATP synthase. So if we can eat water that's come from other animals or other plants from which the deuterium has already been filtered out to a certain extent, then you're going to be better off. So fat, for example, is very low in deuterium, and this is one of my favorite fuel for mitochondria. We should be running our mitochondria on ketones. And again, when you generate energy from ketones, which come from fat and from fiber, you generate metabolic water, which is low in deuterium. So one of the reasons why camels can last in the desert without drinking for as long as they can is because they have a big hump that's full of fat. They run their metabolism on fat, and the business of fat burning generates metabolic water. So their need for water is much less in consequence. And the third thing that we need background radiation, especially heat in the form of far infrared. And we get this naturally from the sunshine, and this is why we all like sunshine. This is why we like sunbathing. This is why we all feel better on a sunny day. This is why we all feel energized on a sunny day. And guess what? People, longevity. I don't know if any of you saw the film on Amazon called Blue Zone, but all those blue zones where there are many people living to 100 years, they were all in around the equator. They were all in lovely warm climates. So heat is very good for us because it reduces the friction in the system. It allows us to get free energy, as I call it, from external radiation. And
so everyone, let's see if Dr. Yeah, she's back. You're back.
Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. But the summary of this slide is that heat is really important. Keeping warm is really important. And this is why we have to maintain our body temperature within a very tight range. If it goes too low, exclusion zone water breaks down and everything goes slow. We know this from animals that are poikilotherms, snakes, amphibians whose body temperature is very dependent on the immediate ambient temperature. If the temperature's down, they're slow, they're torpid, but when they're hot and warm, they can move like lightning. Us mammals, if our body temperature goes low and we become hypothermic, everything goes slow. And of course, if the temperature goes low enough, then you will die. So heat is really important, and we generate heat in our muscles. Much in the form of far infrared heat. In fact, we radiate far infrared heat. And this is why athletes have to warm up first for their optimal performance. And interestingly, during the 2012 Olympics here in London, the velodrome was kept at 29 degrees centigrade because that was found to be the optimum heat for optimum athletic performance. And more records were broken in the velodrome at that Olympics than any previous. So heat is really good for us. We must keep warm. If we get cold, then everything goes slow, including immunosuppression. That's why there's this saying, wrap up warm, because on a cold day, or you'll get your death of pneumonia. People saw that happen and realized then from pure observation the importance of keeping warm. But the mechanism by which that is important is exclusion zone water. Now, one molecule that is absolutely vital for exclusion zone water is sulfate, probably the single most important molecule which thickens exclusion zone water and stabilizes it so that the whole body becomes more stable. And the fact of the matter is most people are deficient in sulfur. Now, where do we get it from? Well, obviously meat, bone broth, meat, fish and eggs. Methyl sulfonyl methane is a very inexpensive and good source of sulfur. And, many of my patients are not wealthy. They don't have money because they can't work, because they have a fatigue syndrome. But this is a regime which I pinched from Dr. G.I. Janelle. Thank you, Dr. Janelle, in order to replace the body's stores of sulfur or sulfate. So you can buy a kilogram of MSM from Amazon for about 20 quid, so it's not expensive. And for 3 months, aim to take 3 or 4 teaspoonfuls daily. And that restores the total amount of sulfate in the body, and then maybe a maintenance dose of half a teaspoon daily. It's possible that this is one of the mechanisms by which being a vegan or vegetarian is a risk factor for chronic fatigue syndrome, because those diets are necessarily lower in sulfate than people are eating meat, fish, and eggs, which are much higher in sulfate. And so without sulfate, you haven't got exclusion zone water. Without good exclusion zone water, your mitochondria will go slow. And that, I believe, is the central pathophysiological lesion in people with chronic fatigue syndrome and ME. Epsom salt baths. In this country, we have a tradition of spa therapies, and the best spas for arthritis are in Epsom, town called Epsom, where Epsom salts are made, magnesium sulfate. Why? Because both magnesium and sulfate massively improve exclusion zone water, and we know that's going to be anti-inflammatory. So it reduces the inflammation in any tissues and reduces the friction, of course. And I think, say, friction and inflammation are synonymous. Garlic and sulfur-rich vegetables are rich in sulfur. Glutathione, of course, which is, I like all my patients to take some glutathione. DMSO, again, is a proven benefit in improving exclusion zone water. And DMSO, again, it's a fairly inexpensive thing. It has multiple effects. The only problem with DMSO is it does make you pong a bit garlicky. Now, I have to say, I don't mind that smell too much, but some people do take offense to that. And then in parallel with this, vitamin B12 is essential for sulfate metabolism. Without vitamin B12, we can't metabolize and employ sulfate efficiently. And this is why I suspect vitamin B12 is so important in a multiplicity of pathologies. It's one of my favorite multitasking tools, and they're detailed are all the pathologies which we know can benefit from high dose vitamin B12. So again, we can explain the effects of that through its impact on exclusion zone water. And again, what's so fascinating, one of the most anti-inflammatory molecules in the body are steroid hormones, things like cortisol. And they are all rich in sulfate. They've all got sulfate groups. And again, I think it was Pollock did started looking at various agents which we know improve exclusion zone water. And there we've got turmeric, holy basil, some lactobacilli, coconut water, aspirin in small doses, just 75 milligrams. These all improve exclusion zone water. So that is going to be a very good start. And then we have to ask, what destroys exclusion zone water? What should we be avoiding in order to optimize our health? And as we've obviously discussed, poor quality membranes. So avoid anesthetics as far as you possibly can. Having said which, if I'm going to have surgery, I want to have an anesthetic. Not drinking sufficient water. So being dehydrated, obviously you need water to make exclusion zone water. Now that doesn't mean we should drink a lot of water. Some of the worst nourished patients I see are young people, especially, who think it's a good idea to drink lots of water, and they'll be swilling back, 3 or 4 liters of water a day. The point here is you can drink pure water, but you can't pee pure water. Whenever you urinate, you're going to be peeing out minerals. So if you drink a lot of water, you have to balance that up with minerals, not just electrolytes, not just sodium, potassium, but all the water, all the electrolytes, calcium, magnesium, zinc, copper, selenium, chromium, and so on. So you need to have a good multi-mineral. And then you have to keep warm. And again, we've touched on this. Hypothermia is characterized by stiffness, i.e. friction, because things can't move. And of course, low body temperature, and so poor energy delivery mechanisms, and so on. And again, this is a particular vicious cycle in the chronic fatigue syndrome patients I see, because they don't have good energy delivery mechanisms, and so they run cold. Our body temperature should be right about 36.8, 37 degrees centigrade as core temperature. But many of my fatigue syndrome patients have temperatures as low as maybe 35.5, 36.0 or whatever. And just being cold will further impair energy delivery mechanisms. So there's a very obvious vicious cycle here. And then again, deficiencies, as we've discussed, lack of sulfate, poor methylation, and that's reflected by a high homocysteine. In fact, in Japan, the reference range for vitamin B12 is you're considered to have a deficiency if your level is below 500 picomoles per litre, whereas in this country, it's about 200. It's set far too low. But you can't have too high a dose of B12. I like to see levels of B12 above 1,000 and maybe 2,000. It's completely non-toxic. As one of my colleagues commented, the only way you could kill yourself with vitamin B12 would be to drown in the stuff. So it's gloriously safe stuff, and again, inexpensive and accessible to all. And then we know toxins will destroy exclusion zone. And of course, the biggest one of all is probably glyphosate. That destroys, and there have been studies done demonstrating that is the case. And glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide in the world. In America, it's used on the crops at the rate of about 1 pound a weight per member of the population. And it's often used at the end of harvesting as a desiccant. So what that means is much of that glyphosate will get into the food chain. So if you're not eating organic, there will be glyphosate there. And, a pound per year per person, that roughly ends up with about 1 gram a day that you're consuming. Now, 1 gram a day is a therapeutic dose. Most drugs are given in milligram doses. So 1 gram of glyphosate is a significant dose. And my view is it's never been more important to eat as organic as you can possibly afford. I know it's expensive, and I'm very sympathetic to that, but if you've got a bit of spare cash, then please spend it on eating as organic as you can. And in addition to directly destroying exclusion zone water, it also disrupts the synthesis and absorption of vitamin B12, which, as we've discussed, is also essential for exclusion zone water via sulfate. It also collates up, these essential minerals. We touched on zinc, which is necessary for superoxide dismutase, and also molybdenum. And molybdenum is essential because you can't make sulfate without molybdenum for the enzyme sulfite oxidase. So avoid glyphosate if you possibly can. My guess is that sugar also destroys exclusion zone water. Now, I searched the literature. I can't find any direct evidence for this, but we know that sugar makes for sticky blood. And of course, we know that sticky blood is caused when you lose the exclusion zone water around your cells. By contrast, running your body on ketones from fat and fiber, that makes for thin blood. It stops, it's an anticoagulant, it stops blood cells sticking to each other. So this is another important reason why we should have a low sugar, low carbohydrate diet and run our body on ketones from fat and from fiber. And again, I think it's very, very likely that spike protein from the COVID vaccine also destroys exclusion zone water. Again, I haven't found any direct evidence of that, but we know that spike protein is one of the most pro-inflammatory things you can do to the body. We know it drives sticky blood and coagulation and myocarditis and all that. These are all associated with inflammation. And I think it's very likely that the mechanism for that is because it's destroying exclusion zone water. And what I give my patients who have developed problems following spike protein is good dose of sulfate, which may be as N-acetylcysteine, it may be as glutathione, but MSM is a very inexpensive form of sulfate, and Epsom salt baths, again, are another way of getting sulfate into the body. And then, of course, other toxins, prescription medications, metformin, which is a widely used diabetic drug, stops the absorption of vitamin B12 from the gut. So that's going to impact on sulfate, and that's going to impact on exclusion zone water as well. Metformin, that's obviously used to treat type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is completely reversible with low carbohydrates, ketogenic diets, and then a few supplements to improve insulin sensitivity. So it's not an essential drug. I might think it's very likely that 5G which drives, which is a very abnormal form, an intense form of radiation, I think it's very likely that that is probably destroying exclusion zone water. And there are going to be lots of other things too, yet to be discovered. But my guess is that anything that drives inflammation, the mechanism by which it does that is through exclusion zone water. And so the treatment of inflammation is to put in place as many things as we possibly can to protect against that effect. Now, there are many products on the market that say, oh, well, you can drink structured water, you can drink it. I just don't buy that, because the structure of water, the structure of the exclusion zone water is uniquely dependent on local factors, i.e. a good quality membranes, good biochemistry, and far infrared heat. So don't go out and spend a fortune on structured water. I just can't see how that works. And say, as we've discussed about, I think there's a direct relationship between exclusion zone water and inflammation. And I think the fundamental mechanism of this is all about friction, which might be physical friction, it might be biochemical friction, and it could be immunological friction. And this is, a fundamental cause of stuff. Okay. Now, another reason that I got interested in this is because I've been playing around with a device called a pain Genie. And what's so interesting about Pain Genie is it's a device that, and I'll give you the links for this, which is very good at treating pain and is very good at reducing inflammation. And anybody can use it. They're a bit expensive, that's the bore. But what they do is they put electrical charges into the body. And what's so interesting about it is when you're using it, I've got one in the other room, I should have brought it out. As you rub it over the inflamed area, you can feel a resistance there. It feels kind of sticky. So if you had a golfer's elbow, a tennis elbow, for example, as you rub the Pain Genie over it, you can feel a kind of stickiness. And as you work at it, putting the electrical information in there, then that stickiness disappears, and that is paralleled by the pain disappearing and the inflammation disappearing. And I think the mechanism of this, I don't know for sure, but I think the mechanism of this, again, is through fourth phase water. Because if the exclusion zones are not there or they're very thin, then tissues stick to each other. So the classic example, of course, the frozen shoulder. We often see these in stroke patients. If they don't move their shoulder, and especially the shoulder gets cold, then it freezes and any movement is painful. Now, the traditional way to treat that is general anesthetic, dare I say it, and then the shoulder is forcibly put through all movements, and then when they recover, it seems to have relieved it. So what's been done under anesthetic is the stickiness of inflammation is being physically broken, so exclusion zone water can re-establish. But I don't recommend that as a treatment. But we can use electrical forces of the Pain Genie to unglue sticky areas, like we see in repetitive strain injuries, bursitis, arthritis, frozen shoulders, migraine, back pain. There is good evidence that Pain Genie is helpful in all these conditions. This is how you use it. That's the link to the Pain Genie website. Again, anybody can buy one of these. I say they're a bit expensive, but when it's something arguably we should all have in order to treat our families, our friends, and our tribe. And there are detailed information about how to use it. And basically, it's very similar. It's very simple. And what I like about it is that there are any number of testimonials. Now, I don't trust many medical research papers because often medical research is set up in such a way to get the desired outcome. John Ioannidis, who is a philosopher in America, states that over 95% of medical research is fraudulent, either because of fraudulent statistics or the way it's set up or for whatever reason. So the only true medicine that we can believe in is case histories, and we should learn from case histories. And that's why I love testimonials from patients, from people who've used it and seen extraordinary results. And I've seen some lovely results, as so some of my colleagues, and you can see more there. So I think that is the last slide. I think I've just about kept within the hour, but we've got time for questions. So I think Daniela suggested you put questions in the question and answer box. So, oh, there they are. Right, I will start going through some of them. Okay, Is the shape of exclusion water related at all to C60 or carbon 60? I don't know. I think you might be talking about buckyballs there, but I'm not sure. But I don't think so. That's if it's I don't think carbon 60. I don't think that's relevant. Okay. Does hydrogen water help with free radicals? Now that's a very good question. I was asked this very question recently, and the answer is I don't know, but it's biologically plausible that it does, and it's biologically plausible that it would improve structured water. I don't know, but the bottom line is we can't do any harm with that. What about wayward water? Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what wayward water is, so I can't help you there. But as I say, I don't think you can drink structured water. It's uniquely dependent on local factors, good membranes, good biochemistry, and background heat. I distill my tap water and use that for herbal teas and cook with it. Is there a danger to using it? No, I don't think so. I think that's absolutely fine. But what you do need to do is put some good minerals in there. I've got a made-up preparation called sunshine salt. Unfortunately, it's only available in this country. I don't export it to America. But I made it up because I couldn't find a preparation on the market that had got all the minerals that I like to see, in a form that's soluble, in the correct proportion, and in a form that's soluble. So I give my patients sunshine salt. So if you are in this country, Stella, if you put a sprinkle of sunshine salt in your distilled water, then that would be a perfect combination. I wonder if drinking gelatin helps create gel water in the body. It's very healing. Well, yes, because gelatin is going to be rich in sulfate groups, and it's the sulfate groups in gelatin that makes it gelatin, because it gives this very powerful, structured water effectively. So colloids are all about gelatin. Correct. Deuterium, a preventer. Yep, that's deuterium reduced water. I'm ashamed to say I don't know how you get in the US. I'm so sorry about that. I can't help you there, but I'll try and look into that. How can you explain how exclusion zone water contributes to the formation of thrombi? Well, it protects. It stops thrombi being formed, because thrombi is when things stick together, either platelets, proteins, whatever, and an exclusion zone water, and you need sulfate for that. And guess what? Heparin, which is a major way for thinning blood, is a sulfate-rich molecule. So, using heparin as a blood thinner, we achieve that because its effect on exclusions in water, because of its high sulfate content. What happens in chronic fatigue syndrome and ME? Well, in chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, if you haven't got structured water, then the mitochondrial enzymes don't work efficiently. So your mitochondria will go slow. So obviously we put in place the raw materials to feed mitochondria, like CoQ10, magnesium, carnitine, vitamin B3 and all that. We get the right fuel in the tank, which is those ketones, but we also think about structured water so that we get those enzymes in the right three-dimensional position. Okay, how do you deal with saturated fats when the person has, saturated fats do not cause high cholesterol, and high cholesterol does not cause clotting. My guess is that lipoprotein may well be something to do with exclusion zone water, maybe to do with sulfate metabolism, maybe to do with vitamin B12. But another clue here is that lipoprotein is the mechanism by which we clot blood in the winter when we're short of vitamin C. Wonderful book by Malcolm Kendrick. I recommend you all read this, called, well, his first book was called The Great Cholesterol Con. His second book was called The Clot Thickens. I love that title. It's absolutely brilliant. But he explains the mechanism by which lipoprotein A can cause sticky blood, because, as I say, it's higher in the winter when we're deficient in vitamin C. So I treat my patients who've got high lipoprotein A with vitamin C. And guess what? We should all be taking 5 grams daily. That's about a teaspoonful. Most people tolerate that fine. Can you address how PFAS, plastic particles, oh gosh. Well, that's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that. but they cannot be doing good, can they? I mean, plastic particles, as we've seen from the Gerald Pollack work, they are excluded by exclusion zone water. So having good exclusion zone water will help to protect us from the potentially malign effects of plastic particles. So, that's all going to be to the good. But I don't know a mechanism by which we can get rid of plastic particles in the body. And obviously, we just have to do our best to reduce our exposure to them. Daniela, am I talking too much?
No, not at all. I'm sure that all of us are really enjoying. Do you want to answer some more? I'm happy with that.
That's fine. Okay. Okay. A question talk about familial high cholesterol, and it needs to be treated. Well, as I say, cholesterol does not cause arterial disease. It's an innocent bystander. I do recommend you follow the work of Dr. Aseem Malhotra, who's a consultant cardiologist and a specialist in this regime, where he wrote a lovely book called A Statin-Free Life. And he details the mechanisms by which cholesterol does not cause arterial disease and so on. He states in his book he's happy to see patients run. He's got patients with familial high cholesterol running at 8, 9, or 10 with no problems at all. Now, high cholesterol can be a symptom of lack of sulfate. So do all these things that we've been talking about. It can be a symptom of the underactive thyroid. So bear that in mind as a possible cause of. So mitochondria, if someone has adverse reactions to things that are supposed to help, like infrared light, synthetic vitamin D, quercetin, okay. Well, that's a rather complex question. And I can't answer that from Anika, in 30 seconds. But if you've got adverse reactions to things, it means very often that the immune system is in a twitchy state. It's just reacting to anything and everything, i.e. you're in a pro-inflammatory state. So there is no one simple answer to that other than put in place all things anti-inflammatory. Just to damp down inflammation as much as you can. We live in a very pro-inflammatory world. The food we eat, the sugar is markedly pro-inflammatory. We're all vitamin D deficient, unless you're taking the vitamin D. We're all vitamin C deficient. We're all iodine deficient. We're all poisoned by glyphosate and other chemicals. So everything around us is driving inflammation. So we just have to try to live as anti-inflammatory life as we possibly can in order to optimize our health. And reacting to anything and everything is often it makes life very difficult. Does that mean camel milk is low in deuterium? Yes, absolutely. Not that I'm a fan of dairy products, because all dairy products are growth promoting. Of course, the reason young mammals consume dairy products is because obviously they're very nourishing in the short term and in the long term, but they contain growth promoters. And if young mammals don't grow very quickly, then they get eaten by saber-toothed tigers. So dairy products are fantastic for young mammals growing, but not for us, not an old crone like me, because old crones like me are at risk of cancer, and I don't want to be eating dairy products which have growth-promoting hormones in them, or growth-promoting proteins in them. Is someone always thirsty if they drink the proper amount of water? Okay. To be hydrated, yes, of course you need water, but you also need good membrane structure. So you need lots of fat, and you also need electrolytes. So as I mentioned earlier, drinking a lot of water, if it goes straight through you, you're going to be washing out electrolytes. So some people are thirsty all the time. Actually, we'd be better off having salt. And of course, we know this is a feature of the underactive adrenal glands. We need adrenal glands to help retain water. And part of that is going to be through steroid hormones because they're rich in sulfate. So think adrenal fatigue if somebody's thirsty all the time and not hanging on to their minerals. Would distilled water be low in deuterium? I doubt it. I think that because they're thinking about the boiling point of water, and my guess is that the boiling point of H2O is similar to H3O pigment in deuterium water, D2O, I mean, and it may even be. Well, I don't know, but it may be that. Well, I'm not sure of the answer to that, but I've never seen that mentioned as a way of getting deuterium depleted water. What does this mean for athletes during cold plunges? Well, as long as you don't reduce your core temperature for a long length of time, I think it's not going to be a problem. there was a physician in the 1980s called Kaka, who is a great advocate of cold plunges, and there was a great vogue for chronic fatigue syndrome patients trying these. And my experience is it usually made them worse, and that's because they're already cold, and having had a cold plunge, they then couldn't warm up after that. And my guess is that what cold plunges do is they give them, it's a very stressful thing for the body. You get a great outpouring of adrenal hormones. So if you've got an adrenal gland that's in a fit state to respond to that, then that's fantastic. But if you've got poor adrenal function, then a cold plunges risk making you worse. So I wouldn't be too enthusiastic about that idea. How about distilled water for health? Distilled water, okay, it's good stuff because you're getting rid of any toxins that may be in there. But I would want to sprinkle some minerals in there, ideally my sunshine salt, to restore some of the natural mineral contents. Okay, if we should stay warm, is cold water? So we've talked on that. Wim Hof, I think we touched on that. Some people aggravate on sulfur-rich foods and supplements. Now that's quite interesting because sulfur also has profound effects on the gut flora and the microbiome. So, and sometimes being intolerant of sulfates can be a symptom that you're actually sulfate deficient, because MSM, for example, in the upper gut, which is an oxygen-rich environment, will feed microbes in the upper gut and feed them sulfate. So you end up with a fermenting upper gut, which is bad news. By contrast, in the microbiome in the lower gut, that's a relatively anaerobic environment. I beg your pardon. So in the upper gut, they get fermented, and MSM in the lower gut, which anaerobic gets, they feed the friendly microbes. So in the upper gut, they feed the unfriendly microbes, but in the lower gut, they feed the friendly ones. And if you feed unfriendly microbes in the upper gut, they produce all sorts of toxins, which we can do without. So I haven't explained that terribly well. I'm sorry about that. But if you aggravate on sulfur-rich foods, that probably means that you're deficient. And in those circumstances, first we'll treat the upper fermenting gut. And the way we do that is to starve out little wretches by don't feed them with sugars and carbohydrates, so a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. Kill them with vitamin C and iodine. So I'll use 5 grams of vitamin C and then 3 drops of Lugol's iodine, 15%. Take them apart. One's a reducing agent, the other's an oxidizing agent. I can never remember which way around, but it doesn't matter. The key thing is take them apart. So I take 5 grams of vitamin C in the morning, 3 drops of Lugol's iodine last thing at night. And that then cures the upper fermenting gut. And you may find then you can tolerate the sulfurs, sulfur-containing foods so much better. Okay, talk about using DMSO, and it's safe to go swimming. Yep, it's fine to go. Well, I'm not a great fan of swimming pools which are full of chlorine, but then swimming is good for us. I could talk all day about DMSO. Therese, if you send me an email, which is I'm office@drmyhill.co.uk, I'll send you my DMSO handout, and it's all in there. Okay, lime spirochetes for a cooler body temperature. Of course. I mean, this is one of the ways by which microbes get into us. If they reduce our body temperature, then we are less able to fight them. And of course, the converse of that is true. How does the body normally fight an infection? By running a fever, by getting hot. This is why we shouldn't be giving children and adults antipyretics like aspirin and paracetamol to keep the temperature down. Let them run a fever, because running a fever, kills the microbe that's involved. Now, everybody panics about, if children run a very high temperature, then they might get a fit. Yes, that is possible, but it's rare. And although it's very frightening to look at or to observe, it's not damaging to the baby, to the child. And obviously, if a child does get it, is prone to fits, then you monitor febrile convulsions. That is, then you obviously monitor the temperature carefully and use paracetamol judiciously. But don't, if the body's running a fever, let it run a fever. This kills infections. And so often, I suspect, you get fatigue syndromes because people pick up their virus, typically glandular fever or flu or whatever, and they symptom suppress with paracetamol and aspirin and all these drugs, which stop the immune system fighting that infection well. So running a fever is a very good thing, and it should be encouraged. What is a high level of homocysteine? The homocysteine should lie between 5 and 10. I can't remember the units off the top of my head. But a very useful and wonderful website is called Food for the Brain. It's been set up by Patrick Holford. And there you can get a do-it-yourself kit for measuring homocysteine. It costs £49.50. The homocysteine should lie between 5 and 10. Now, the point about this is Patrick demonstrates that there are 3 important things for preventing dementia, because this is what the website is all about. One is low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. Dementia is now being called type 3 diabetes. It's sugar damage to the brain. Secondly, measure your homocysteine. And again, because homocysteine is directly toxic to the brain, as well as being a marker of the methylation cycle, and that, for that, sulfate is centrally important. 3 things: fish oils. Eat fish, and again, as we know, oils are essential for membrane structure. And the fish to remember are the oily fish, and as he calls it, smash it: salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and herrings. They are the oily fish that we should be consuming at least 3 times a week. But Patrick's done a fantastic job on that website. It's free. Anybody can join it. Do sign up to it. It's the largest ongoing study into dementia and preventing dementia. He's now 5. He got over 500,000 people signed up to that. Okay. What can I do as protection if I need to go on to full anesthesia in port surgery? Well, when you're having surgery, you want your exclusion zone. You want to be anesthetized. So, but after surgery, make sure you put in place all these things we've talked about to restore exclusion zone water. Which mineral supplements? I use one that I made up myself called Sunshine Salt, which has got all the minerals in, all 12 minerals in, plus there's a big dose of vitamin B12 as in the methyl cobalamin, and there's a big dose of vitamin D as vitamin D3, and it's for what it is, it's very inexpensive. What form of B12 is recommended? Well, obviously the best form is methyl B12, and that's what I put in my Sunshine Salt. And again, for the absorption of B12, sort out your gut, because if you've got a fermenting upper gut, if you're having too many carbohydrates, then you're going to malabsorb B12. Okay, what is structured water? Well, I'm sorry, Annika, if you haven't been listening to the lecture, but structured water is exclusion zone water. It is gel water. It's the different names for the same thing. Is the pain Genie similar to avalimite? Oh, gosh, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry. I don't know what the Avasia microelectrical current device is. But we are electrical beings, aren't we? We are entirely comprised of electromagnetic forces. And this has been completely or nearly completely ignored by conventional medicine that tries to reduce things into, drugs and molecules. But so electrical forces are going to have profound effects on our well-being. How do MRI brains that? Well, that's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to look that up. But MRIs, I don't know. They're relatively benign interventions. Whenever you have any sort of scan, always ask the question before you have the scan: is this going to change management? Scientific curiosity is an expensive and a dangerous thing. So yes, sometimes MRI scans are very useful for the business of diagnosis, but there are an awful lot of scans that are done needlessly because they don't actually change management. Okay, question 10, and my model works. The answer is I don't know. Far infrared sauna, yes, excellent. Near infrared sauna, yes, excellent. Sunshine, yes, excellent. Chlorine dioxide, I don't know how that impacts on exclusion zone water. Okay. Can you speak a little on far infrared heat and near infrared heat? Yeah. Well, all light is good for us. The more light and sunshine we get in the day, the healthier we are. I'm very lucky. I work in my conservatory, so when I'm sitting in here, it's dark at the moment, obviously, but normally I get full spectrum light coming in here. Many people choose to live in warmer climates because they feel better. Why? Because they're getting so much more light. So light of any shape or form is totally desirable, and infrared light is fantastic. I say the best wavelength is 3,000 nanometers, but all light is good. Red light, near-infrared light, far-infrared light, they are all good for structured water and therefore for damping down inflammation and improving energy delivery mechanisms. Okay, you make a strong point about consuming high-fat treated diet. Would you recommend it even with? Absolutely. Again, as I keep saying, cholesterol is not a driver of arterial disease, it's a symptom of. So HDL cholesterol is the cholesterol that's used up in the business of healing and repairing arteries. So if the HDL cholesterol is above 2, and I like to see it above 2, we can infer that those arteries are in good shape. So, so I like to see the HDL high. Again, one of the jobs of LDL cholesterol is to transport fats to the liver so they can be converted into ketones. So I expect the LDL to rise on a ketogenic diet, and that's a good thing. It tells us we're in good fat burning mode. So, that is, it's not a bad cholesterol, it's a totally desirable cholesterol. And as I say, these lipoproteins, are high if sulfate is deficient, because normally the body can carry cholesterol around as sulfate. So having a very high cholesterol might be a symptom of just not enough sulfate. Daniela, you've appeared again. I'm mindful I've only touched upon the questions. We might have to have another session.
I know. We have to have another, if you move from the Q&As to the chat, you can see that there are so many people that are thanking you for this wonderful presentation.
Bless you. That's so kind.
Absolutely excellent and full of information, very useful. I feel super empowered now. I know that if I follow your advice, I'm going to live for 120 years, like a true Sardinian, and all of us. So really, thank you from all of us. This is excellent. And you are very welcome to come back. It's such a treat for us. And so if you have time and we can organize it, we will absolutely welcome you again. Thank you. And I just wanted to announce that the replay will be on for a week from Friday to Friday. So people that have missed a few things, they can still listen to you again and again. So again, from all of us and from the team and from all the people out there listening, thank you so much, Sarah.
My pleasure. Thank you, Daniela.
Lovely evening. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Yeah. Good night. Good night, all.
Good night. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.